Good morning. Welcome and thank you very much for attending the international webinar, Energy Transition in the Oil and Gas Industry in Latin America. At this webinar, we will be joined by an important group of professionals who will share their expertise and views on the issue we are here to discuss today. Before we start this webinar, let me explain how it will work. Panelists will participate in 3 rounds of questions of 5 minutes duration each, with a round of questions from the public at the end. The question and answer button is at the bottom of your screen. We also wish to inform you that a simultaneous translation service is available for this international webinar. To access this service, go to the bottom of your screen and click on the interpretation button on the Zoom system. This webinar is a Perú Energía event, an event organized by Prensa Grupo. We would like to thank our official media, the magazine Energiminas. Again, we would like to thank all participants present and in particular the panelists. Let us introduce them. Alexei Kovshin. Alexei is Vice President of Van Meers Energy. He's a fiscal policy advisor for governments and national oil and gas companies. He helps develop fiscal terms and policies to attract investment in exploration and mature projects. Alexei also designs policies for governments to address energy transition through gas development, integrated projects, and the financing of downstream infrastructure. He also delivers Van Meers courses and multi-client studies. This morning, we are also joined by Irene Alfaro. Irene is a chemical engineer from the Universidad de la República de Uruguay with more than 15 years professional experience at Arpel, mainly as a project manager in the areas of industrial health and safety, refining and fuels, pipelines and terminals, and climate change and energy efficiency. For 8 years, she has directed the downstream area and at present is leading Arpel's strategy and activities in terms of energy transitions. Also with us this morning is Beatriz de la Vega. Beatriz is a lawyer with more than 22 years experience and who specializes in legal and tax consulting and sustainable projects for the energy and natural resources sectors. At present, she's the lead partner in energy and natural resources at KPMG Peru. The moderator of the panel will be Diana Lizárraga, the head of the legal department at Perú Petro. Diana is a Peruvian energy lawyer with more than 15 years of experience working on natural resources-based projects. She holds a Master of Laws in Petroleum Law and Policy, granted by the University of Dundee, United Kingdom. Diana is the head of the legal department at Perú Petro, where she previously worked as a senior contract specialist. We will now leave you to start this webinar under the moderation of Diana Lizárraga. Diana, go ahead, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning with everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Perú Energía for inviting us to this event. For me, it's a great pleasure to be moderating this panel with great professionals. And the topic of today is very important. It's very relevant for all economies around the world, energy transition. When we talk about energy transition, we are talking about the challenge of continue covering the energy demands of each country while also reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. This scenario brings opportunities and challenges for the economies and also for the companies. So I would like to start this panel with a question for Irene. Irene, how do you think energy transition is an opportunity for Latin American companies?
Thank you very much, Diana. Thanks for the question too. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure for Arpel to be part of this webinar. I would also like to thank Perú Energía for this invitation, the rest of the panelists who are with us today, and the entire audience present virtually. As far as the opportunities that energy transition provides to the sector in our region, we've recently published a white paper in Arpel. It is a document that reflects the position of all our members on energy transitions and analyzes some of the main opportunities derived from the energy transition, apart from seeking to contribute to the development of a roadmap for energy transitions in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. The document, which is freely accessible and available on our website, represents a very important commitment of our PEL companies, private and state-owned, and it's the only one that reflects the position of a highly significant segment of the oil and gas industry in Latin America and the Caribbean to support the process of energy transitions. There are a lot of opportunities derived from this process. I would first like to mention the access to energy. You know that access to energy, affordable, safe, abundant, and efficient and clean energy. It can be considered a premise for sustainable development. In fact, the UN defined it that way in the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. In this sense, we think that natural gas provides reliability and flexibility to the power system and is an abundant source in the region in particular. Better access to it can replace other more polluting fuels and improve the use of renewable energy sources. LPG is another fuel that can help improve access to energy in the residential sector. This is the first opportunity. A second one has to do with energy efficiency. Energy efficiency represents one of the pillars to activate economy growth and a means to strengthen energy security with reduced environmental impacts. According to the IEA, more than 40% of the emissions reductions required to comply with the Paris Agreement could come from energy efficiency in the energy, transport, industry, buildings, and infrastructure sectors. The availability of external financing sources for energy efficiency projects in the oil and gas sector has been significantly reduced, which makes it difficult to implement them, especially in small or state-owned companies, which are the common in our region. However, energy efficiency projects in the oil and gas industry represent more cost-effective investments than many other measures that promote energy efficiency on demand. With regards to energy efficiency, I would also like to point that we should place special consideration to developing regulatory frameworks, creating specialized agencies, and improving the quality of information, standards, and codes. This way, we can allow the acceleration of the adoption of best practices and technologies that promote energy efficiency in the sector. One of the great challenges that we still face regarding the efficient use of energy resources, and this is a specific example in the energy efficiency chapter, has to do with natural gas flaring associated with oil production. In 2020, this practice in the region represented the emission of approximately 49 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That is around 13% of the world total. Another aspect that represents an opportunity has to do with technology neutrality. Technology innovation will be key to achieving the transition to a low carbon economy. And here both industry and governments have a key role to play. It is important that government policies aimed at reducing emissions from energy consumption, respect technology neutrality, inviting competition and innovation in the private sector, instead of outlining a specific route to reach the desired end goal. This would encourage the development and implementation of a range of technologies and associated industries, forming more profitable markets. However, it is also good to point out that considering the contribution of oil, gas, and biofuels production to the region's economy, some governments will want to develop policies that directly support certain low-emission technologies before they become commercially viable. This can apply, for example, to advanced biofuels and carbon capture, among others. Technology-focused efforts to reduce emissions must be part of a systemic approach, seeking to prioritize actions where they are most efficient. Another opportunity related to this one I just mentioned has to do with carbon capture. According to the IEA, the capture, use, and storage of carbon is considered one of the key technologies to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In addition, the IPCC concluded that with this technology, the cost of achieving climate change goals could increase to around 138% by 2050. In this sense, governments could consider the concrete implementation of strategies and policies supporting this technology to achieve its climate goals. We know that some of the obstacles to overcome for the extensive use of this technology are economic feasibility, regulatory approaches, and limited public acceptance. Another opportunity I would like to mention has to do with carbon pricing. Carbon pricing helps to internalize environmental impacts, discouraging operations or investments that generate more emissions. This can allow companies to trade emissions quotas and offer a predictable framework for operators to undertake projects that promote emissions reductions, which could be economically unfeasible without the incentives that carbon prices offer. Now that nations reach consensus on the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it is expected that carbon markets and cooperative mechanisms will rapidly spread and grow all over the world. The final chapter, and apologies for the extra time, has to do with regional energy integration. It is a key opportunity derived from energy transition. The resources, the geographic location, and the infrastructure in the region create potential scenarios for greater optimization of the energy market. So this is a very important opportunity that I would also like to remark. That's it, Diana.
Thank you, Red. That was a great broad approach about the energy transition opportunities that you have well identified. You mentioned one important point is the importance of having a coherent public framework, public policy framework. And talking about that, Alexei, I would like to ask you, what set of policies countries that are serious about energy transition, especially oil-producing countries, can implement to promote this transition?
Yes, greetings to the audience and greetings to my fellow panelists. As you correctly formulated the question, Diana, is what do countries that are serious about energy transition should do? So the bottom line is that the way countries, governments have designed policies for oil and gas projects, these policies, unfortunately, are not set for the energy transition for a number of reasons, which I will discuss in a moment. So, to enable or for countries to integrate into the energy transition and not to fall out, they will need to change their approaches. And how deep they should go will depend on how serious they are. The first input for governments is that more and more countries start to realize that the window for monetizing oil and gas reserves in the ground is closing. So we see a lot of interest from countries to offer acreage, and this is something that we have never seen before. We see countries which historically were very conservative, Abu Dhabi, Angola, Algeria, Nigeria. They're starting to promote aggressively because they know that they should try to explore the undeveloped resources as soon as possible while the world still needs oil and gas. There is somewhat brighter future for natural gas, but not so much for oil. And at the end of last year, we saw 25 ongoing bidding rounds, which is a lot. And the response from the petroleum industry was not great. And the reason for that is that the fiscal terms are too tough. The fiscal burden is too high, and government should consider switching to a market-driven fiscal burden, whereby companies, based on their assumptions, based on their view of the energy transition, because they will have to live with these projects for the next 20, 30 years, they would bid what the royalty should be, what the production sharing should be, what the other special taxes should be. So the first is the level of government take will need to go down to enable countries to move with energy transition. Another aspect is the structure of fiscal terms. Most countries do not have fiscal terms that flexible enough that can adjust to oil and gas prices. Another important policy is to revise the approach to natural gas. In most jurisdictions, including Latin America and worldwide, the terms for natural gas are still very tough. And it has two components. First, the fiscal terms itself, which represent the cost side of the project, but also in many jurisdictions, the domestic market prices are also challenging because domestic market prices, if the prices are regulated, they represent the revenue side of the project. So we see, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the fiscal terms may be okay, but the gas prices are too challenging. And even before fiscal terms, the projects are marginal or uneconomic to develop. So the approach for natural gas will need to be changed, and everyone, including us, we expect the golden age for gas because it is a permissible fuel in the energy transition. It is a bridge fuel, and a lot of work will need to be done by countries. And we already see that. Again, from some unexpected parts of the world, like Algeria, like Nigeria, countries that historically never paid attention to promoting this kind of reserves. Carbon capture is another aspect, this very challenging technology, which is in most cases simply uneconomic on itself. So we see some approaches, and this is something that all governments will need to address at one point or another. And we already see some incentives, fiscal incentives for carbon capture, but another approach is through the level of taxation on oil and gas projects. So it needs to be reduced to enable companies deploy or try to deploy carbon capture as soon as possible. The way that petroleum contracts should be structured will also need to be changed. And surprisingly, this is driven by the industry. that they want to see changes in the petroleum contract because they need to report back to their shareholders and stakeholders that they're not just sitting, that business as usual, but they're trying to change, they're trying to adopt. What kind of changes that could be? First, switch to more biddable items compared to fixed fiscal terms. Issues with contractual fiscal stability, which is a very sensitive question for companies. In the context of energy transition, of course, there can be some fiscal stability, but largely it is an open-end system to allow governments implement carbon taxation and other measures to meet the international conventions. The contracts will need to start discussing what to do and what would be the carbon footprint from operations. Then this is something that doesn't exist in contracts in pretty much any country in the world. What would be the carbon footprint from operations? What do you do with emissions? What are you permitted to use oil and gas for in-field operations? Or you need to find a way to use renewable energy to reduce the footprint from the upstream projects themselves. And we already see this happening in a number of countries, and we expect this to further expand. Another important aspect is changes in the resource management. So basically switching from two-dimensional model to three-dimensional model. Not many countries are doing that, but we see this in Mexico, for example, whereby it gives the government more flexibility. If an investor sits on a license area and not interested in developing some of deeper horizons in the strata, with three-dimensional system, the government has flexibility to offer those resources to a third party, because again, the window to monetize remaining reserves is shrinking. And the faster the government will understand this, the more actions we will see. And this will in turn increase the competition, which is a good thing overall, but may be hard for some jurisdictions that like to keep the taxes very high. And probably the last for the moment to mention is the switch to, or having provisions in contracts which indicate that petroleum contracts may simply switch to energy contracts in the future, that companies will have flexibility to simply provide energy from integrated projects. And we see this, for example, in, again, a bit unexpected parts of the world like Iraq or Oman, where there are pilot projects to combine renewables and gas production or oil production. And this simply is an energy contract that has a much lower carbon footprint.
Alexei, what you just mentioned seems to me very interesting, because if we are talking about now energy industry in general, not making a difference between oil and gas or renewables, but just companies that supply energy, that will also mean a structural change in governments and how they are organized. So I want to know, what do you think? Are we going to still have oil and gas agencies, or are we going to have more like an integrated body in governments that will grant licenses to companies to exploit or produce different energy sources?
We believe that the integrated approach should result in more coordinated actions. And we actually see this in a few countries that are trying to reorganize the industry, where the electricity regulator is merged with petroleum and natural gas authorities, precisely for this idea. So for now, it seems that the integrated regulators seem to be a better strategy to implement these changes.
Thank you, Alexei. Beatriz, Alexei mentioned that one of the main drivers of these energy transitions are the very same shareholders and investors in the oil and gas industry. They want to know what are the consequences, what are the impacts of the projects they are investing on. So from your experience and work, I would like to know how important is nowadays for companies to report and disclosure their greenhouse gas emissions, and how does it affect on their aiming to find investments?
Thank you for the question, Diana, and also thank you, Perú Energía, for the organization of this event and to be with these friends in the region, such as Alexei, Diana, and Irene. Well, this is an important question because since the fight against climate change is not something new, but of course, since Paris Agreement, it took better form for all the countries, starting in Europe. But of course, as Irene and Alexei are mentioning, there are in different levels in the world, and I think in a slower way in Latin America, the implementation of regulations and policies to push forward this initiative. But as you mentioned, there is something very important, like in addition to regulations, on the other hand, the companies need to develop projects in order to reduce emissions. And as you mentioned, in the past, or maybe not so far ago, 2015, there were companies that start revealing in the financial statements, and because the majors are listed in different stock exchange, they were presenting voluntarily how and what kind of projects they were performing in order to reduce emissions. And because there are initiatives and there are worldwide standards to do that. For example, the Global Reporting Initiative, in which companies present the sustainable projects that they are performing in order to achieve this climate change emission reduction, and also to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are others that are more for financial purposes, like the SASB and the tax force related against climate change. But those ones, all of these initiatives were voluntary. And these ones were reports that didn't have any impact in the financial statements for companies. So they start revealing themselves the purpose to contribute with the zero CO2 emissions. However, something that, of course, the private sector was requesting is how I will comply with the regulations if I don't have enough funds to do that. And for that reason, also currently, the financial sector, talking not also the private financial sector internally in each country, but also the multilateral financial institutions are getting aligned in this effort. How that is happening? Because of the last COP in Glasgow the last year. And what is creating that? Currently, no more than 1 month ago, the stock exchange in Europe and also the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission in US, released some new regulations in order that include in the financial statements not voluntary reports, but mandatory reports in which companies have to include projects that are related to the reduction of CO2. But of course, as Alexei and Irene was saying, it's important to have incentives. For example, in US, there is an incentive in the Internal Revenue Code in order to have a tax credits in the case of carbon capture sequestration. And we are already experiencing the case of Oxy, the case of Exxon, and including Chevron, doing those projects. So carbon capture sequestrations for oil and gas companies are currently in place. So, and because there are some incentives. We are not there, as Irene mentioned, is something that, of course, in the region, Latin America is exploring, but we will need incentives to do that because it requires a lot of investment. But the good news is that if companies align with these new ideas to include in the portfolio projects that are in the line of Paris Agreement, they will find sources to finance. And in addition, other thing to say, to be more specific regarding to your question, is that of course, why these new regulations are applying first to companies that are in the open market, listed in stock exchange, because if the companies don't perform this kind of projects, the value of the share could go down. So that will be the impact. So that will push that companies start doing more projects regarding that. But as it was mentioned, regulations, incentives, and if we have in addition the financial sector, the providing the funds to develop those projects, it will be, of course, interesting to achieve the Paris Agreement goals in shortly.
Beatrice, we have a question from the audience, and that it's just is related with what you just said. Is how does the Paris Agreement contribute to energy transition? Does it?
Well, in first of all, how is the relationship between Paris Agreement and energy transition? First of all, when we review by industry, who is creating more emissions in the global market, is the energy sector is the first. Second is transportation. So there is a first of all established how we will push the reduction of CO2 in the future. We need to put our efforts in the energy sector. And Paris Agreement is not only an aspirational treaty among all the countries in the world. It includes in the clause number 6 the obligation of more developed countries to fund and help with technical assistance to countries that are in process of development. So for that reason, for example, in the case of Peru, we already have since 2 years ago, a government-to-government agreement in the frame of Paris Agreement to develop technical assistance and funding to help with the CO2 reduction. But what is the focus in this specific case? The medium and small enterprises. Because we need to align everybody, because in parallel, as I was mentioning, big finance for listed companies that are more bigger taxpayers, contributors, is those ones that I was mentioning.
Beatrice, what alternative do oil and gas companies currently have to find or to invest their exploration and development projects? What are the new project finance requirements?
That is an important question, because aligned with I just say regarding the requirements of the stock exchange, ESG standards are today on the table of the board. So it means environmental, CO2 emission reductions, social impact, and good governance. So are the three areas in which the boards are changing the mindset, and it's something that comes from the top down inside of internal decisions. And for example, as you are mentioning, if today some company wants to approach a financial institution and wants to present a nice project for the development of upstream, for example, it's possible. But in the compromises, in the way that the project will be developed, for example, it's interesting how companies are including some projects that are aligned with the ODS, the sustainability
Development
goal
goals.
number 6 to access to energy. That what includes the, in some cases, the execution of renewable projects in remote areas, off grid. So that is the opportunity that oil and gas companies still have in order to develop upstream, for example. And not only that, it's not only for the project itself, also including projects that are related to energy efficiency, which also could include renewable. It's like, as Alexis mentioned, is a mix in which if I have funding, I can also contribute, because what I need to take care is the reduction of the carbon footprint. And with these stock exchange regulations, the listed companies will also have to include the supply chain in the future. Not now, maybe in 2-3 years, but the supply chain also will be important to negotiate with these big companies and include CO2 reduction projects and sustainable projects aligned with ESG standards.
Very enlightening, Beatriz. Alexei, taking what Beatriz just mentioned, it seems that it's getting harder and harder to find someone to finance an oil and gas project, especially during the exploration and development phase, particularly in frontier areas or in areas with environmental sensibilities. What strategies do you think government should implement to boost oil and gas new ventures?
Right. The historical approach which governments have been using and still using as a strategy is fiscal incentive for unexplored areas, for frontier areas where exploration risks are high because not much exploration activity was done in the past. So exploration risk is very high, but also there is no infrastructure. So even if you make a discovery, to bring this oil and gas to the market will be incredibly costly because there is no infrastructure. So historically, governments try to offer special fiscal terms for such frontier areas. And there are many examples, either reduced royalties or no royalties, or some taxes don't apply altogether for such frontier areas. So this is a powerful instrument, and basically it increases the value of a project, and it is easier for potentially interested investors to find the right partners that may be interested in this high risk but potentially high reward projects. When fiscal incentives are not sufficient, and this is what we start to see, if project relates to, for example, sensitive environmental areas in the Amazon or in sensitive systems in the Arctic, it doesn't matter what the fiscal systems are. Governments cannot attract large international companies because it doesn't fit in their environmental and energy transition strategies. So if large firms cannot be attracted and the fiscal terms are already very attractive, what do you do? And we see that governments try to actually set up special funds that use the money from oil and gas production. And these funds will be, the government through these funds is willing to co-invest in the projects. And we see this just recently. Nigeria has announced that they're establishing a special midstream gas infrastructure fund because they want to increase the gas use in the country. There is no infrastructure to enable these gas developments. That is not just the case in Nigeria. If you go to United States of America, North Dakota, gas cannot be utilized because there is no infrastructure. And it is simply burned. You cannot even re-inject it because on shale formations, it is not a viable option. So these funds set up by the government do the opposite thing that the national sovereign funds are supposed to do. Sovereign funds are supposed to invest in very low risk, very secure investments to make sure that the money will be there. These funds are set up to precisely help develop some of the challenging, potentially uneconomic pilot projects or high risk projects. So that is another option which we see some governments start to develop, and we expect to see it more, particularly for gas development where a lot of infrastructure is required. If there is no infrastructure, then you cannot expand the use of gas if it is somewhere in country far from the market. So that is another option in addition to fiscal incentives that we see governments are doing.
Yeah, what you just mentioned is also a problem in Peru. We have natural gas, but we do not have a well-developed infrastructure to transport that natural gas and monetize it. So hearing you, Alexei, I was thinking about in the energy transition, do you believe that the role of the national oil companies will change? And if that, how do you see is the new face of national oil companies?
This is a very good question, and with all the benefits that national oil companies can provide to nations, not the case in Peru for sure, but there are a lot of examples where national companies are not that efficient compared to privately owned companies, domestic or international. In those countries, probably the role of national oil companies will be limited to only supplying, developing some reserves to supply domestically in case of some emergencies. But for the majority of jurisdictions, we believe that the role of national oil companies should be reduced, and these funds can be but I mean national oil companies of course can still exist, but they also need to be transitioned to more of energy mindset suppliers, energy regulators, and this is actually important role that they can play, taking care of some of the investments in the bottleneck in the infrastructure. They can take care of some of the critical infrastructure that can be leveraged by privately owned companies to supply the resources. So national oil companies for sure will stay, but their role needs to be also transitioned to switch from, especially in countries where national oil companies are not very active, they don't contribute much to the project needs. It is not the case in a lot of countries in Latin America. National companies work pretty much under the same rules as their private parties, but no question they will need to change their strategy and move towards more becoming energy, not regulators, but also energy companies, expand their portfolio with other segments of integrated supply chain.
That's very interesting. Irene, I was reading here a question of an attendee, Cesar Carreño, who was asking about whether the government's commitments toward energy transitions which are the commitments that governments have towards energy transitions. And I was thinking about something that you mentioned before about the importance of having a consistent public policy. I wanted to ask you how relevant it is to have an energy transition plan at national level.
Thank you, Diana, for this question. Yes, indeed, it is critical. One of the most important factors for a country to drive transitions to lower emitting energies is a sustained and consistent public policy framework. Legal certainty is essential to attract investment in energy projects since it provides a predictable set of conditions for their development and operation. For this reason, it is important that governments seeking the transformation of their energy systems do so through roadmaps that reflect stable policies agreed upon with stakeholders. They should also develop clear governance structures to ensure continuity of energy transitions and institutional stability to accelerate the reduction of GHG emissions. The volume of investments required to achieve cleaner energy system and to meet the expectations of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements, as it was previously mentioned too, it far outweighs the capabilities of governments alone. Therefore, transitions will also require public-private partnerships. At COP26 last year, it was a deep regret expressed about the goal of $100 billion per year for financing established by the parties to the Paris Agreement in 2015 for the period 2020-2025. In the first 2 years of this period, 2020-2021, a funding level of approximately $80 billion was barely reached, that is about 40 billion annually. So financing will continue to be a contentious issue in the negotiations as 2025 approaches, when they will have to agree on a new financial target for the following years, even higher than $100,000 million per year. So this is also linked to financing.
Thank you, Irene. Beatriz, I was reading some of our attendees' questions. They are asking about the hydrogen projects, biomass plants, new technologies, funding. I wanted to ask you, how do you think economies in Latin America will be affected by the worldwide policies pushing towards the net zero carbon emissions condition? Which business trends do you identify coming?
Well, in the case of hydrogen in the region, there are initiatives. In the case, for example, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Mexico, they already put together stakeholders that are behind pilot projects regarding hydrogen in different stages. In the case of Chile, perhaps more advanced, they have already a lot of regulations in order to incentivize projects in hydrogen, and also good potential for Peru. Still not a project itself, but just even 1 month and a half ago, it was proposed a bill of law regarding the promotion of hydrogen in Peru. And so what happened is that in the case of South America, talking about hydrogen is a good match with a lot of mining projects that are already in place. in which the machinery needs to move with some source of fuel. So hydrogen is presented as a new source that could be important for reduction of CO2. And but it's not only a discussion or something that is in the agendas in Latin America, but also around the world. There are other, in the case of Europe, perhaps Alexei knows more projects about that. There are already machinery, trains that are moving with hydrogen. But what is happening now with the conflict, Ukraine-Russia, is that, of course, countries, most in the case of European ones, are searching out quicker new alternatives in order to reduce the dependence from the Russia the Russia source as an important producer in the world. So that will create opportunities, and as I mentioned before, since there will be finance sources, that will be also an opportunity for these other projects such as hydrogen that require not only financing resources, but also regulations. In the case of the region, if we talk about Latin America, as currently, as of today, Chile has more than 20 regulations in place regarding the promotion of hydrogen. And there is not clear incentive in terms, for example, of fiscal terms or tax incentives in order to the return of the investment be at least in 5 years. It doesn't exist yet, but it's something that is on the table. And it will be important to see the development perhaps quicker than we expected. And I think it's something that will happen with the impulse of Europe and companies that have presence in the region. Also, these stakeholders that are already in groups in these associations will create more kind of push to the governments in order to pass regulations of incentives.
Thank you, Beatriz. Alexei, and what about a market approach? I have heard about carbon taxing, carbon pricing, green bonds, climate bonds, climate change bonds, sorry. Do these initiatives do really work? Have you seen this kind of policy making a difference on how the local economies develop?
Yes, for carbon taxation or similar approaches to help the energy transition to gradually reduce or create incentives to reduce the use of fossil fuels, I think by now all the economists have agreed that carbon taxation is one of the best solutions. So a lot of countries already have carbon taxation and more countries will join. However, there are a few comments that I think worth making. The majority of countries that have carbon taxation are those countries that consume most of fossil fuels, so basically developed jurisdictions. If you look at the supply side, at the countries that produce the majority of our oil and gas, fossil fuels, both OPEC and non-OPEC, these are to a large extent emerging economies, developing jurisdictions, which I personally work a lot in. And carbon taxation in those jurisdictions is not very high on the agenda. Some countries still cautious about that and they would like to introduce it. And if you introduce, you need to design it properly. The majority of carbon taxes now, they are levied basically on end consumers, on people that trying to put gas or petrol in their cars. some jurisdictions, which is, I think, more efficient for empowering oil and gas companies, is when carbon taxation is levied directly on petroleum operations. Norway, for example, is doing that. So in addition to the general carbon tax in the country, there is special carbon taxation on petroleum operations. So it becomes part of the fiscal package for the project. That is not the common approach. And I think that is the most efficient message to force oil and gas companies to transform and become more efficient in that regard. So for countries that do not currently consider carbon taxation, they will have to do it anyway, because the initiative that the European Union, for example, has, which is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is essentially an import duty. So the carbon tax, which would work as an import duty. So if oil and gas is imported from a country that doesn't have carbon taxation, Nigeria, for example, in order for that oil and gas to be permitted to the European Union, it would be subject to carbon taxation. And this mechanism forces the countries that not yet implemented carbon tax to do so. And last year I had some discussions in the region, Trinidad and Tobago, for example, Suriname, they probably wouldn't have considered carbon taxation, but because of the European Union incentive, they have a choice. Have the tax and collect it themselves, or simply pay to the European Union. And for governments, I think the answer is very clear. Have the tax and collect it in your treasury. So the European tax is not yet implemented, but it seems it is going ahead. And in fact, just in March, they have finalized the general approach. So hopefully in the next few years, it will be rolled out, and all countries that do not currently have carbon tax and produce oil and gas will have to address it. Otherwise, there will be a leakage that will simply go to importers. Now, this brings me to the issue of fiscal stability. So what do you do as a government if you need to introduce a material carbon tax that potentially will be applicable directly to upstream operations? So it will become a cost to oil and gas project. What do you do with contractual stability if you have it? And probably you will need to readjust some of the other terms that you have, maybe reduce a little bit of the royalty or reduce the corporate income tax, but likely make an adjustment to account for this newly introduced tax. There's not that an issue if the overall level of taxation is not very high, but in jurisdictions, especially in Latin America, in some countries, level of taxation is very high. And if you introduce one more tax, then you'll have to deal with readjustment, which is a difficult process, both for governments and for companies, and takes a lot of time, and it slows down the investment during negotiations. So that is a serious matter.
Thank you, Alexei. Irene, after reading the paper that you mentioned of Arpel, I was wondering, which are the countries that are leading the path in Latin America towards energy transitions? Who should we be looking at as an example? Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Diana. First of all, it depends on which specific aspect we are addressing. In general, in the region, energy transitions is a very emerging topic among regulations. Unfortunately, it is still very emerging. Anyway, we have some specific cases that are leading on specific aspects. For example, Chile is one of these examples with regards to hydrogen. Colombia is another leading example also with regards to hydrogen. After that, we have, for example, Mexico with a pilot project on carbon markets, but it depends, again, on which aspect we are going to analyze, because energy transition has to do, as we've been discussing over this hour, has to do with several different aspects. If we, for example, if we talk about carbon taxes, as Alexei was mentioning, we only have 5 countries in the region with an explicit tax to carbon implemented. We have other 3 countries that are considering implementing such tax. We even have countries that have rejected, explicitly rejected to implement carbon taxes. So it depends on the specific topic we are discussing. Regarding carbon markets, as of today, we only have this pilot project in Mexico, which is still under implementation. We have other countries that are considering the implementation of carbon markets. We expect, as I mentioned before, that now that Article 6 has been completely approved with regards to its implementation, we expect to see a rapid growth on carbon markets over this year, or at least this year, next year. It will rapidly grow its implementation, but so far in this region, it is still very emerging. It is different with regards, for example, to renewable energy, because fortunately our region is very rich in several sources of renewable energy. And let me also explain one of the questions that appeared in the box with regards to which are the renewable sources to focus on. We understand that we need to implement all the different renewable sources available depending on the country. And it is not only one, it is a mixture of the sources available in each country. And we will also need to consider hydrocarbons for many years still, because the first thing we need to ensure is the energy access at first. We need to ensure a just energy transition. Okay, so this is very important. With regards to transport, we are, I think that it is one of the most mature aspect in the region with regards to energy transition, because there are a lot of countries, most of the countries in the region are prioritizing transport among all their NDCs, their commitments with regard to the Paris Agreement. So it is, I think it is the only aspect that is quite mature in the region.
Thank you, Irene. That's very enlightening. We have received a lot of questions. I'm very happy for that. It's going to be difficult to make all the questions to our panelists, but I will choose some of them. For example, Beatriz, Federico is asking, how can we finance a project of carbon capture and storage, and to which financial mechanism we can look for?
Well, first of all, we need a clear regulation to have in place how will be, among others, the recovery of the investment. Normally, in general, if we are talking about a long-term investment such happen in oil and gas, the incentives are made to recover the investment in the first 5 years at most. And also how it can be incentivized for the investor, the effective use of the cash or the funds in the preparative stage. Nothing of that is still including specific regulations in the case of Latin America in those terms. So what we need to do is to review the legislation in place if the economics can help to do that. But as I mentioned at the beginning, also it's important the incentives. Talking about how to recover the investment and make a net present value positive. And for that reason, as I mentioned, in the case of US, in 2018, there was include these tax credits, for example, in order that around, in average, 35 cents per ton of CO2 be used against income tax. In that way, it's a manner to incentivize a project, a new project, such is the case of carbon capture. And I remember Irene mentioning, based on the studies in the region, that is something that it will be interested by the players in the region, but we need that regulations incentives. Funding, so how I can access to funding, we need that, because if the regulations are not clear, it's a little bit complicated to make accurate financial model in order to present to the financial institution how to the financial institution will secure that the investor will repay the money that will be invested. So I think that we are in that stage, but it's something that is coming soon because the multinational companies, if they are in the open market and have presence in the region, possible that we will start in seriously at least experiencing some pilot projects regarding carbon capture here, no, in Latin America.
Right. Alexei, everybody acknowledges that natural gas is important during this energy transition and will be important during this energy transition. However, countries have this challenge, especially rich natural resources countries have this challenge of still promoting the investments in the exploration of oil and gas. For example, that's the case of Peru, for example. That each year has lost investments. Investor projects have been closed. Companies have announced that they are preferring to focus their investments in mature projects rather than in exploration projects. And I can imagine that many other countries in the region are in a similar situation. So Antonio Parihuana is asking, how do countries can promote exploration of natural gas?
Yes, natural gas is gaining its momentum. More and more countries realize the importance of natural gas as a long-term strategy, that if you become a substantial gas producer, then you can stay in the, or rather you can monetize it for much longer compared to oil. So it is very high on agenda. And historically, natural gas, the policies for natural gas were not sufficiently detailed and thought through compared to oil. So there are two issues. First, historically and currently, the level of taxation for natural gas, either the same as for oil or maybe slightly lower for oil. And this means that if you have a pure gas project, it is not very attractive. So the first thing that governments can and should do is to redesign the fiscal terms for gas development. And this simply means lowering taxation, whatever the fiscal component the government is using, whether these are royalties, depending on their design, if they're simple royalties or based on an R factor or something else. So the royalty rate should be lower, or special taxes need to be lower, or abandon altogether for natural gas projects. Corporate income tax can also be lowered. So governments can do whatever they want as long as the bottom line of the taxation is lower. And this is something that we see being done in the last few years in a lot of jurisdictions. African countries try to promote gas development. Very conservative jurisdictions like Angola and Nigeria, they have very favorable gas terms because they really want to increase exploration production of natural gas. So lower the taxation, the level of taxation, that is the first and most important step. In jurisdictions where the domestic gas prices are regulated as opposed to be free market for pricing, that is also needs to be addressed, because if prices are regulated, and this usually means that they're very low, then even before you need to pay fiscal terms, if you analyze the potential exploration project, because prices are so low, revenue of the project is very low, it's uneconomic. I had elaborate discussions in some of the countries in the Caribbean, like Trinidad and Tobago. Historically, the government wanted to promote the industries that feed on natural gas, like all kind of manufacturing processes, and they wanted to make sure that the gas is low, the gas price is low, so they can promote these industries. Now, the government wants to produce production of natural gas, but the prices are so low, about $1 per million BTU. So it doesn't matter how attractive, in this situation, doesn't matter how attractive your fiscal terms are. You need to redesign the gas prices for gas. So in those jurisdictions, it is the second component, which is really the part of your fiscal package. If prices are set based on market forces, then the government should focus on the fiscal terms. If prices are regulated, prices should also be increased. These are the most efficient ways how governments can do it. And the problem today is in most countries, the terms are just too tough for natural gas. And the competition is rising. Just as we have mentioned, the crisis in Europe, that Europe is trying to switch to new sources. I have seen at least 2 discussions about this expansion of natural gas and LNG experts. Alaska, who has been considering an LNG project in the Prudhoe Bay field for decades with no effect, has now finally wants to go ahead with it because there is an opportunity and there is a case to develop this gas. There is an expansion in some African countries, in the Republic of Congo, again, to develop it, to expand the LNG, to see if they can provide, supply this gas to Europe. So there is a bright future for gas, and governments should seriously redesign the fiscal terms to make sure that the fiscal terms are adequate and set to increase production, while again, they can still monetize these resources.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, Alexei. And it seems that it's very challenging to promote gas exploration, oil and gas exploration at these times. However, it's feasible. Irene, you mentioned that one of the main factors that we should consider in the energy transition is energy affordability, and energy security. Some of the attendees are asking, why are we talking about gas, natural gas, and we do not pay attention to the development of hydro power plants and other renewable energy projects, considering the enormous potential that we have in general in Latin America. As you also mentioned before that compared to other regions, Latin America has a lower greenhouse gas emissions rate compared to Europe or to North America. So what do you think, should countries pay attention to or focus their effort on the natural gas developments, considering the opportunities that Alexei, Beatriz, and you mentioned before that this will bring to their economies to work in the energy transition path? Or should we focus on the hydropower plants and other alternative of energy sources?
Thank you, Diana. Well, in fact, there is no, there's not a unique energy source to focus on. It depends on the country. Again, at a national level, governments should analyze which are the resources available at the country to try to implement and to exploit all of them, because there won't be an energy source that will lead the energy transition. That's impossible. The energy demand is increasing constantly. So we need, first of all, we need to comply with this energy demand, because for governments, the priority should be the energy access for the people. That's one of the social indicators for the development. So we cannot only focus on the cleanest energy source possible. We have to choose a mix that best fits the possibilities of each country. And again, fortunately, our region is very rich in several different sources, and most of them are renewable. So we will still need hydrocarbons for many years, but we have to start using all of the renewable energy sources available to go over this process as fast as possible. And natural gas will be key in this transition, because it is it is a resource in most of the countries of the region. It has a great potential for this transition, in the sense that it complements with other energy sources, with electricity, with hydrogen itself. So it is important to look at all the resources available: natural gas, hydro, wind, solar, hydrogen, everything that the country has under its resources.
I totally agree with you, Irene. That's the key. We cannot just put attention in one type of project. We have to work in parallel different energy projects to cover the different needs that there are in the countries. Not everybody consumes tons of energy. We have also to think about the small families, the small scale energy consumption for the growth of the economies. As a final, I would like to ask each of you a final question, just to sum up all the interesting things we have been talking about today. And I will start with Beatriz. The same question will go for also for Alexei and Irene. Beatriz, what should governments and companies keep in mind in leading to a sustainable energy transition?
I think there are two axes. One of them is, of course, the treaties that already oblige the governments to incorporate regulations in order to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. Is I think one, and we are experiencing more as Irene mentioned, different alternatives to do that in the region, such as incorporating renewables, hydrogen, EV, etc. And on the other hand, companies that are looking for funds, because it's important also that will depend of how the companies are considering the effects that could have in them COVID also. So for that reason, it's important to identify the opportunities. In the case of, for example, oil and gas company that is producing, the prices are going up. So of course, it could be a good moment to keep some cash in order to look for new projects, or on the other hand, start doing pilot projects in order to incorporate emission reductions. And somebody was mentioning nuclear, and perhaps Alexei could talk more about that. We don't see that in the region in Latin America, and because it has some constraints, and also because in the case of Latin America, if we talk about some countries, there are some countries, for example, Costa Rica, that are closer to achieve or already achieved to have a green energy matrix. In the case of Peru, that I am from, the energy matrix is natural gas and hydro. So the opportunity, for example, then, if we see companies focus in incorporate in the development plans projects that include the compliance of the sustainable goals. Number 7, I took in the first part when I said number 6, the access of energy. We have a regulation for renewables, for example, but for a small projects, it's 20 megawatts under, with some incentives. So there are some companies that are using this law for that what exists in the law, because if we are waiting for the political issues not only that occur in Peru but also in the region, we could not advance. So what is happening is that companies are exploring under the current regulations what they could do. And one alternative is if companies want to continue operating, if they have access to funding, all the projects have to include social impact, have to include how doing a project will include transformation in the life of the people, which is what also Latin American countries are under the Sustainable Goals Paris Agreement. Both of them are important axes that will create opportunities for oil and gas in this energy transition context. What will happen is that the companies are or will incorporate in their specific energy matrix the diverse portfolio. If I want to develop a project, oil and gas project, social development of people with funding to do that. If I want to reduce my emissions under operations, energy efficiency projects, I have to do investment in technology. There are currently a lot of acceleration of technology. If I have funding, I can access to also incentives to do that. So this is the second. And the third is how I create in my supply chain this, incorporate this idea that to make business in different way, it means including in my private contracts, how these companies, my providers, are doing the same than me will be important. Because what I am saying is what will happen if I don't do that, my share will get reduced if I am a listed company. If I am not listed company, it will happen the same, because it's a pressure in the market that will impulse you to do that because you are in the business. So I think that will happen. It's a complex subject, but we are seeing little by little that this is getting incorporated in the head of the boards of big companies, and not only big companies, but we are experiencing this change of mindset, I think.
Alexei, do you agree with Beatriz? Are you in the same line?
Yes, absolutely. And just to begin with addressing Beatriz's comment about the nuclear, indeed, the nuclear in Latin American region is of course much lower compared to North America and Europe. And we do not expect that nuclear will be increasing in the region because there are some catches and concerns associated with nuclear, although we see some new nuclear being implemented in the Middle East, in the Abu Dhabi, but it has environmental concerns. And of course, this is a very clean fuel, but it is the waste management that is a big concern. And until we have any new breakthroughs in the nuclear power plants, we don't expect this to expand in the region. But what governments should think about, and I'm not saying this because I'm a fiscal policy expert, but fiscal policy, in my opinion, is something that is easy for governments to do. This is achievable. It does, of course, require some political decisions and legislative changes, but regulatory changes relating to fiscal policies are necessary and should be implemented by governments to implement and be part of the energy transition. And at the same time, I fully agree with Irena that it is the primary responsibility of governments to ensure that there is access to energy for people. It is the direct responsibility. This is what governments are for as part of an array of their functions. When the sun goes down, there need to be access to electricity, to clean cooking, for kids to learn, to study. So this is primary goal. And if we're talking about fossil fuels, natural gas is an obvious choice to promote, to make your overall energy matrix cleaner. If you look at the overall region, some countries are doing much better than the others, but the share of coal, for example, in the overall region is still high. If you go to the Caribbean, the share of oil in the energy matrix is unreasonably high, which all needs to be replaced with renewables or natural gas. And natural gas, again, not saying this because I do this as my day job, but this is something that is very achievable for governments. As long as the political decisions are made, it is possible to address this and improve the energy matrix and benefit from all the developments and impact on the economy from development of gas projects.
Thank you, Alexei. Irene, one of our attendees is asking whether are there any multilateral mechanisms to pressure countries for a faster energy transition? You know, are we having the speed that is needed under the CO2 below above 2 degrees Celsius that is has been discussed by several scientist panels, or should we do a little bit more to transition faster?
Thank you, Diana. Well, there's no way, there's no organism to pressure governments as the first answer to this question. The only valid organization with regards to government commitments in climate change is the UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement is a very clear example of all the commitments, and some of them are legally binding too. So it is a very remarkable step in the history of addressing climate change at a government level. So I think it is the best example. We gathered almost all nations all over the world for a unique objective. It took a lot of efforts, and I think that that governments, even in the region, considering all the difficulties and the challenges we are having, there's a large degree of commitments among governments to achieve this goal. Okay, so I think that the way to move forward is not by pressuring governments. It's just the opposite. It's by collaborating among all stakeholders, from the private sector. Now I'm talking on behalf of ARPEL and the sector in the region. We are ready and willing to support the acceleration of energy transitions process through dynamic cooperation and integration as required by the energy industry and markets in the region. Because it is clear that the fundamental part of this process is cooperation between all actors. This is a huge objective for the global, for all countries in the world. So national governments, public companies, private sector, civil society, the academia, the financial sector, international organizations, all have to work together and cooperate, because it is different from other environmental impacts. This is a global impact. So what we are doing here in South America affects all countries in the world. And this is a very huge responsibility for all the society in the world. The roadmaps for energy transition have characteristics and implementation times that are unique to each country again. However, there are several common factors that we have seen over this hour and a half discussion, and we need to focus on those common aspects to work together. And let me also comment something about nuclear. I didn't specifically mention nuclear, but it is definitely one of the sources that we need to analyze. The problem with nuclear has to do with the reluctance that the community itself has towards this source. So this is the great challenge it will have to face for an increase in its implementation.
Thank you, Irene, Beatriz, and Alexei. It has been a pleasure to share with you today's panel. We have so many questions still to answer. You know, energy transition is a very rich topic. It has many angles to cover, but I'm glad that we have shared this hour and a half talking about such an important matter. So thanks to you all, and I will leave the floor to Camila. Thank you.
Many thanks to the experts who have provided us with a better view of energy transition and opportunities for the future of the oil and gas industry. We would like to thank everyone who has participated in the international webinar. On behalf of Perú Energía, we would like to thank you for your participation. This was an event organized by Prensa Grupo. We would also like to thank our official media, the magazine Energiminas. We'd also like to express our thanks to the media partners who have supported us in the dissemination of this meeting: Gerencia Ambiental, GNL Global, BN Américas, and Magazine Energía. We will see each other again on Perú Energía on October 17 and 18. Good morning to all of you.